Ah, Elden Ring, the great masticator of keyboards. If you throw a stone on this cursed website, there's a pretty solid chance that you'll hit a 50,000 word essay exploring some aspect of FromSoft's critical darling. Be it spirited discussions of how the lands between are designed, philosophical treatises on the punishing mechanics of the Souls-like genre, or the healthy cottage industry of YouTubers that try to make sense of Elden Ring's esoteric lore. A lot of ink has been spilled trying to pin down the intangible aspects of this game into words. I picked up Elden Ring when it was on sale this Christmas, so I'm about a year late to the zeitgeist. But after putting around 20 hours into the game, I'm struck by the unique sense of place that Elden Ring possesses. The atmosphere, the art direction, the pure gut feeling of existing as a digital avatar in this horrid yet beautiful universe. There's something undeniably unique about the world of Elden Ring. The question of what that secret game feel sauce is has kept me occupied during my time with the game, and after my 20 or so hours, I've boiled it down to a handful of factors. The broad well of cultural influences FromSoftware draws from, Elden Ring's unique approach to narrative, the crushing difficulty of the game, and Elden Ring's strange ability to inject comic relief into the most miserable of moments. These four factors, in the humble opinion of this faceless internet stranger, add up to create a specific niche culture that not only exists within Elden Ring's 45 gig file size, but spills out into the internet at large. So, with no further ado, let's take a peek at the weird vibes of Elden Ring. I'm a big believer in the nothing new under the sun school of cultural interpretation. Irrespective of the artist's intentions, art will always draw from what came before it. The modern Star Wars franchise deals wholesale in Campbellian myth structure that's about as old as the written word. In every spaghetti western, you can see a shade of Kurosawa's samurai films. Grand Theft Auto 4's storyline drinks deep from the trough of the Brat franchise. Nothing is made in a vacuum. Sometimes art wears its influences on its sleeves, sometimes it obscures them, but they're still there, creating the building blocks of the piece's identity. Elden Ring is no different in that regard. Most of what we see on screen can immediately be tied to recent cultural works of high fantasy like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, which in turn draw on European folklore of knights and dragons and maidens. From a purely visual perspective, there's oodles of Redbubble items drawing a comparison between Van Gogh's Starry Night and the way the lands between present themselves to the player. I won't argue with that. They're both very pretty and surreal, but let me throw in another painter into the mix. The 15th century Dutchman of mystery, Hieronymus Bosch. Presented here is Bosch's masterwork, The Garden of Earthly Delights. Divided into three separate panels, the painting shows the Garden of Eden on the left, the human world in the center, and the terrible depths of hell on the right. There are far too many nipples on screen for me to zoom in without being hit by the YouTube demonetization stick, but even from a distance, I reckon the inspiration is clear. The painting is sprawling and surreal and filled with anguish, but much like the world of Elden Ring, there's also a sort of comic absurdity tied to it all which escapes words. If you open the painting in another tab and zoom in for about 30 seconds, you'll notice another theme that ties the painting to Elden Ring. I'm not an art historian by a long shot, but through a combination of my day job and simple curiosity, I've seen my fair share of medieval paintings and noticed this particular fixation reappear over and over again. I'm sure there's a savvy 50-cent word that academics use for this concept, but I'll keep it simple with an understandable phrase. Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, much like a lot of art from the days of knights and kings, is filled with weird butt stuff. Welcome to 15th century European art. We'll get to Elden Ring's finger butt hole fixation soon enough though. First, let us take a peek at how Elden Ring introduces its players to the game. Upon starting a new game, the player gets to choose from 10 different character classes to play as. To jump off the previous point about cultural influences, the choices are quite varied. We have the Sword and Shield Vagabond, your generic European knight. The Scimitar-wielding warrior, drawing inspiration from the Middle East and North Africa. The muscle-bound hero, balancing somewhere between Norse myth and Conan the Barbarian. The bandit, a fantasy ranger, or your run-of-the-mill highway robber. The astronomer, a mage who looks like he'd be at home in the courts of King Arthur or Rudolph II. The prophet, a midway between a Greek oracle and a hungry ascetic. The samurai, repping FromSoftware's native Japan with a katana and a bow. The confessor, glowing with those friendly Inquisition vibes. The wretch, a naked person with a club for those who like challenge. And my personal favorite, An unidentified political prisoner from the reign of Louis XIV who died in the Bastille on the 19th of November 1703, aka the Man in the Iron Mask. This time, instead of shackles, he's armed with an estoc and a magical wand that shoots ghost daggers. The choices for the look and feel of the character expand wildly after the opening hours, but Elden Ring's initial impression is limited to these 10 choices. There is details to be sculpted on the archetypes' faces, but the game has a habit of putting helmets over those, so they are of very little consequence. Once all is confirmed, the player is treated to a 4-minute cinematic introduction to the world of Elden Ring.
The fallen leaves tell a story. The great Elden Ring was shattered. In our home, across the fog, the lands between. Now, Queen Marika the Eternal is nowhere to be found. And in the night of the Black Knives, Godwyn the Golden was first to perish.
I'm sure there's someone in the comment section who put in more hours than I and studied up on their lore videos, but to me, and I presume to the majority of Elden Ring's player base, the story presents itself as less literal and more impressionistic. A magical doohickey was destroyed, the queen is missing, her kids fought over the bits of the shattered doohickey, no one won, and now the world is all messed up. It's up to you to, kill them? Fix stuff? Befriend the loathsome dung eater? In a run-of-the-mill Western RPG, you'd be about 30 minutes off from a dialogue wheel, where you could get details on what the Elden Ring is, theories about where Queen Marika went, and whether there's any health benefits to the loathsome dung eater's diet. Most Western games will spoon-feed you plot points if you ask for them. Here, in the lands between, you're left crawling under the table, trying to tell apart scraps of narrative from bits of discarded tissue. Even though much of Elden Ring's iconography draws from the literature of medieval Europe and other high fantasy adjacent buckets, the plot eschews the usual Western Aristotelian focus on beginnings, middles, and ends, and hangs out in the Eastern storyist poetry territory. At times, the story feels less like a straightforward narrative and more like an interactive Rorschach test that the player is invited to project their own ideas onto. For example, at the start of the player's journey, the humanoid characters that don't attack on sight refer to them as maidenless. Without any in-universe context readily apparent, the player is left to decide what it means to be maidenless on their own. Is it simply another reflection of our poor renown? Is Vare teasing us about not getting any bitches? Or is maidenless a fitting label for a brave knight, chucked into a massive world without a set goal to achieve? Again, there is a literal explanation including finger maidens and runes and a variety of other things one is sure to notice on their third playthrough, but none of the plot is explicitly fed to the player. Elden Ring's narrative plays second fiddle to the game's systems and art design. It's a steady hum in the background that you can pick up on if you so desire. No one's stopping you from weaving your own interpretations of the world. After the suggestive imagery of the cutscene, the player gets their real first taste of Elden Ring. They materialize in a broken down church. The ground is littered with broken furniture. The church seems long abandoned, as if untouched for over a century. All is ancient, except for the dead woman in the corner. Bright red blood lies pooled at her feet. When the player examines the dead woman's body, they find a tarnished, wizened finger. Within the context of the story, the item description of the finger reads as follows. A finger of corpse wax, so emaciated the bone is visible. It is a relic of those who came before, left to help those who would come after. Functionally, the finger serves as a means of writing messages to other players, but we'll get to that in a bit. With only one way to go, the player pushes open a creaky metal door. The world outside is filled with dust and wind and flakes of gold. The trees are dead, weeds have eaten up the ancient paths, and the few rickety platforms that are still standing lead off to bottomless cliffs. With only one way to go, the player descends down from the church and crosses a creaking rope bridge to a graveyard littered with abandoned swords and broken spears. In that graveyard, the player is promptly murdered by a multi-armed mass of human flesh. Elden Ring's artistic direction quite often deals in misery, and its gameplay trades in frustration. After the initial opening section of the game, the massive world of Elden Ring opens up to the player. If they want to, they can spend the next couple of hours hanging out around the much sunnier, forested province of Limgrave. With quick reflexes, they can even avoid death from the various knights that patrol the quaint paths among the trees. On a long enough timescale though, Elden Ring will lead the player into dining halls filled with human flesh and villages where crazed husks of humanity whimper from the pain of being alive. A lot of ink has been spilled discussing the appeal behind the difficulty of Souls-like games. On the off chance you're not familiar, here's a quick summary. When you defeat enemies in a Souls-like game, you're provided with currency that you can use to make your character stronger. This can only be done at resting points that are few and far between. When you rest at these safe locations, the world around you resets and all of your enemies come back to life. If you die before reaching the safe point, you drop all the currency you were carrying. If you die trying to get them back, the currency is gone forever. Most games punish death with a loading screen. FromSoft punishes you by wiping your game progress, and then with a loading screen. I'll save you the 6-hour video essay and boil down the appeal of this pseudo-masochistic system to folks enjoying a challenge. Since death comes so easily in FromSoft's world, and the punishment for it is so steep, there's an ever-present tension wherever the player goes. There could be a multi-armed mass of human flesh hiding behind any corner after all. It's not just the game's mechanics alone that are punishing though. Throughout the lands between there are, for the lack of a better word, pranks. You'll find yourself walking down a clear stretch of road when, all of a sudden, a bunch of wolves drop from the sky and eat you alive. Fair? No. In line with the narrative of the game? Definitely not. Entertaining? You're the judge. If the game were to just deal in harrowing imagery, punishing mechanics, and occasionally unpredictable sadism, I bet it would be far too oppressive to be an entertainment product that would attain global recognition. Who would, after all, want to play a game which revolves around constantly having your head stomped in? How does Elden Ring get around these overwhelming feelings of futility? There are plenty of unfair surprises waiting for Elden Ring players as they move through the world, but those that move with caution and take in their surroundings are rarely surprised. Even though traveling through Elden Ring's world is primarily a solitary experience, there are notes on the floor written by other players which warn you of upcoming dangers. Entering a new room in a dungeon where the enemy is waiting to slip its claws into you the moment you pass a threshold? If you look carefully, there's a decent chance another player who suffered the same fate left a note by the door telling you to check right. If you look carefully, that deadly surprise isn't much of a surprise, and if it isn't much of a surprise, then it's probably not very deadly either. Writing messages to other players isn't as easy as typing out your thoughts though. The grammatical structure of the writings that the wizened finger can bring into other players' worlds is loopy and limited. Their meaning, much like the overarching plot of Elden Ring, is often cryptic, and they do, on occasion, lie. Overall though, the notes left by other players take away some of the solitude from the experience and provide ample warning with some of the more malicious challenges that Elden Ring presents. The wizened finger, however, isn't just a means of warning other players of looming death. It's also a great vehicle for jokes. Even though the messages that can be communicated in Elden Ring are limited in structure and wording, anyone who's ever messed around with a Mad Libs book knows that there's plenty of Dadaistic chaos to be found with limited resources. In the darkest, most depraved corners of the lands between, you can always find some sort of joke dealing with either fingers and butts or implied oral sex. Par exemple. In one of the early sections of the game, hidden in a dark cavern, you can stumble upon the abandoned village of the Abernathics. It is filled with corrupted humanoid creatures with stunted legs who have to drag themselves across the ground and can be spotted in the darkness thanks to their incessant weeping. The village is rotten and filled with dead bodies. The creatures that crawl through it are miserable, and once you reach the end of the village, you have a conversation with one of the few last lucid survivors of whatever misfortune took place there. At the far end of the village, there sits a giant pot. When you strike the pot, one of the village's strange inhabitants manifests into existence. His hair is withered, his mouth is puckered into an eternal scream, and his legs cannot hold his feeble body upright. Unlike his kin, however, he does not wish to harm you. When you find him, in the voice of a frail old man, he pleads with you not to kill him. When he realizes that you mean him no harm, the man gives you half of an amulet and then promptly dies of old age. All in all, it's a pretty miserable scene. The old man coughs and struggles and has clearly lost all will to live, but right next to this dying old man, there is a message implying oral sex. He is, after all, on his knees and his mouth is, after all, wide open. The finger butt hole and blowjob jokes in Elden Ring definitely trend towards lowbrow comedy, but when placed inside of this tortured high fantasy world, they provide an emergency comedic release valve that prevents the environs from becoming too much of a bummer. The strange, player-generated humor expands past the weird sex jokes though. One of the most charming, nonsensical things I've ever witnessed in a video game is the player base's bizarre affinity towards turtles. Whenever one comes across these small shelled creatures in the world, there's always a grouping of messages around the reptiles referring to the animal as dog, and usually inviting the other players to praise this dog. Is there any logic here? No. Is it charming and endearing? Hell yeah. It's not just players insisting you praise the hole at every waist-high crevice and praise dog at decidedly non-canine creatures that injects much-needed lightheartedness into Elden Ring's darkest corners though. There's plenty of quirky design choices to keep things light and breezy as well. Take for example, the goats. All throughout the world of Elden Ring, there are goats. On first blush, these virtual goats are no different from the goats you might have encountered in the Flesh and Bone world. They look like goats, they sound like goats, and for the most part, they act like goats too. The moment you get close to them though, they roll. They look like goats, but they roll like destroyer droids trying to overthrow Naboo's government. Is this insane form of movement meant to be a reference to the constant rolling the player has to do in order to escape Elden Ring's bosses? Is there an in-universe explanation for why the goats of the Lands Between roll? Do the goats roll just for the goofy effect? Honestly, I don't know. Chances are you probably don't know either though. This wealth of strange creative decisions, from the loathsome dung eater to the turtle pope, to whatever the hell was meant to be happening at the Leia Lucaria Academy, infuses the game with a charming dream logic quality, which adds to Elden Ring's unique character and creates this weird world that's just so much fun to get lost in. Delivering my little TED Talk in this informational superhighway of ours, I'd be amiss not to mention the wealth of virtual content generated off of Elden Ring. All the guides on how to optimize one's character builds, videos discussing the plethora of secrets hidden in the map, and enough lore deep dives to put the Library of Alexandria to shame are just more evidence of Elden Ring striking a loud chord with culture at large. At the start of the video, I said I was a bit late to the party, and with it being about a year since Elden Ring's release, I guess I am. With the sheer amount of things worth discussing in Elden Ring, however, I think that party is going to drag on for quite a while though. And on that note, I'm off to play more Elden Ring. Hope you enjoyed my little offering to this cultural monolith.
Are you quite finished? Take this opportunity to learn to master your emotions. Worry not, I take no offense. But others are not always so forgiving. Some take to anger, others sorrow. Bonds are fragile things, wont to break under strain. And once they're broken, everything is lost, with naught to gain.